Hi, welcome to the channel. My name is Richard and I'm the Bull Rider, and today I'm going to show you how to do a old school valve job on a 5-liter even fire Lamborghini V10. And if you're new to the channel, I recently pulled the motor out of my 115,000 mile Lamborghini Gallardo Superleggera, and I was having an issue with the valve stem seals leaking profusely into my cylinder and blowing a bunch of James Bond smoke out the back. So I pulled the motor and pulled the cylinder heads off, and we can finally get a good look at really what the root cause of this problem was and do a really good valve and cylinder head rework on this cylinder head. And I want this to serve as an example that you can treat this car just like any other car and do a very good job at it and not spend that much money, but just have a little bit of elbow grease, a little bit of diligence, and you'll get down the road and you'll enjoy your car at the end of the day. So let's jump right into it and I'll show you exactly what you need to know. As usual, we just have a bunch of T30 Torx all throughout here. And then the cams will come right out. This is held on with RTV, so you might have to do a little bit of prying underneath here, and then this whole cover will just pop right off. Whoa. So we heard a little pop there, but that was the residual spring tension on the valve springs. And I'm not too concerned about it. And honestly, we can't really avoid that because no matter what, you're always going to have some sort of tension on the camshafts, and it's really just something that we just have to accept the inevitable, and then we can take it out after it pops out, and then we're good to go. So we got the intake cam, take that out. We got the exhaust cam, take that out. So in here we have the rockers, and then underneath there we have the springs, and then we have the little guide for the rockers that is actually oil filled. So you have a little port on the side, and then through this, and the oil comes in through this galley right here, and then it comes out the top, and then it comes out through the top port right there on this rocker, lubricates the rocker, the valve spring, the valve, and then eventually leaks into my cylinder head. So that's fun. And then we're going to take this out and individually mark where each one of these goes, and we'll put it aside. We're going to get our valve spring removal tool, and we can put this on the back of the valve. Mine is so loaded up with crap that I think I have to use this this other valve spring tool that comes with the kit. These are very cheap, about $13, and they work great. So you're going to put it on the back of the valve, and then we're going to find the appropriately sized valve spring removal tool. Go ahead and compress that spring. Get a little ping there, it's okay. And you can see those two little bodies that are popping up. Those are called the keepers, and they keep the valve seated to the spring assembly. Okay, and once we have enough gap between those two, we can get our little magnet and pull one keeper out and pull the second keeper out, just like that. And you see the ridges on the keeper align with the ridges on the spring. So putting this back is going to be a big pain in the butt, but we'll get there. And then pull that spring out. And then once the spring is out, we can just pop this valve right out through the bottom. And there we have it. Fuzzy from my towel. First thing I want to point out is to make sure you have everything organized. So for both the intake and the exhaust, I have everything organized in here so I know exactly where everything came from and where everything goes. Because you want to keep the profile of the various surfaces matched with the profile of the other ones. So that way it doesn't accelerate any sort of wear, and the components that were in there to begin with go into the same exact spot where they were before, and all the bearing surfaces are the same. Same goes for the valves. I like to put them in a little cardboard piece, and then I label them to the front of the motor, and then it goes to the rear. So both the intake and the exhaust, and then, you know, self-explanatory, right? So inside here we have our valve stem, and then that's where the valve actuates in and out. And then on the top of that we have the valve stem seal. So the valve stem seal has a little spring on the top of it. You can see this spring on the new valve stem seal. So either on mine, the valve stem itself has failed, like the rubberized portion, or the spring has lost tension. And that's what's causing all the oil to enter my cylinders. So taking these out is pretty easy. All we need is the special valve stem seal removal tool, and I recommend getting these because one, they're cheap, And 2, I don't recommend using pliers because you might damage your valve stems. And I do not want that to happen on your $6,000 cylinder head. So we're just going to go in there and apply pressure to one side of it, clamp down, and try to yank it off. It probably won't come off the first try. That's okay. And then I'm going to go in at a 90-degree angle from where I initially applied pressure. Try to... You don't have to be that particular about this. It's just forcing it. And of course, when I'm filming, nothing ever comes out easily. So there we go. Cool. So this one's missing the spring. It might have just fallen off. I got to look around for it. We're going to be cleaning the cylinder head anyway, so no big deal. But you can see the comparison of the old one and the new one. It's a little bit eccentric for me ripping it off, but you get the idea. Okay, to clean these valves, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to get a piece of tape and wrap it around the top of the valve. And this will interface with the drill chuck and give us a good interface mechanism for not scratching this area, because you have the valve stem seal that interfaces in this sort of region right here, and it's just good cheap insurance. So let's do that first. All right, then we can throw it in the drill chuck. So I'm going to be using a drill press, but you can use just a little hand drill, and this is good, no problem. And then when we turn it on, you might notice I have a lot of back and forth when it comes to this drill press. This is what us in the industry like to call typically a piece of shit. And for moderately dirty intake valves that are relatively don't have that much carbon built on them, I just recommend getting some brake clean. This is non-chlorinated, by the way. And then a Scotch-Brite pad, and that's all you need to clean this valve. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a little bit of brake clean on the Scotch-Brite pad in a new area, and then when we turn on the drill press, we're just going to apply it right here. The Scotch-Brite pad is not as hard as this valve, so it won't damage or mar any of the surfaces. Getting pretty close. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So let's move on to one of the exhaust valves, because that's going to be pretty tricky because of all that built up carbon. For this one, I'm going to be a little bit more in depth. I'm going to use a brass wheel, only use brass, and then I'm going to try to get rid of as much carbon as I can on the surface and on the bottom surface while the drill press is spinning. What you'll notice is it takes some of it off, but then it just like leaves this like weird polished surface on it. So I'm going to start with the Scotch-Brite pad, and if you have issues with that, you can always try to pry this off with a screwdriver. I've done that as well, where you just start taking off all this like carbon. It's so packed on there. It's just crazy, especially if heat. It just like loves to bond to this metallized surface. Getting pretty close, you can see. I'm going to call that good. What we're really concerned about is trying to get this little plunger rod to properly sit on the top of this valve. So if we're getting good contact here, as you can tell, I'm happy with that. So I'm going to call this good. Just a little bit of carbon left over, but sometimes you just can't get it all. You know, it's just almost impossible. Right, so all of our valves are clean. It took me a little bit. And then we're going to start on the cylinder head itself. And we're going to try to clean all this carbon out of here, all this oil, all this junk. And we're going to first start with a little bit of brake clean. And we're going to pre-treat all the cylinders of the head, all the ports, just a good amount of brake clean. And we let that sit. And then we're going to go in with a wire brush, a brass wire brush, mind you, and start cleaning out these exhaust ports until they're all clean. I'm going to avoid this top surface right here, because this is where the cylinder head gasket mates to. So you want to avoid any sort of scarring or abrasion on this surface itself, and we're fair game inside of here. But next, we're going to clean up any sort of gasket material left over from the cylinder head gasket. And so you're just going to get a razor blade and then you can run transverse to the length of the razor blade. If you run this way, it's going to actually cut the aluminum. So just be very careful and just look for any sort of residual from that cylinder head gasket and clean up anything that you can find. And be sure to go over all of the surface, just make sure it's perfectly clean. And then we'll go flip it to the other side. And then when we go ahead and flip the cylinder head around, we're going to find all this leftover RTV all over this cylinder head. So we go ahead with the razor blade again and just run transverse and just carefully shave off all that excess. I'm going to go outside and wash this down and get rid of all the residual carbon that's left in there. But overall, it looks pretty good, and we can go ahead and start to clean and prep this block for the next step. So I know there's a lot of detail in this video, and I want you to stick with me. Hey, you might be on a Jeopardy episode where they might ask, how many valves per cylinder is in an even fire Lamborghini V10? And you can say, well, 4, because you watched this video. So let's watch to the end, and there's tons of detail packed in here. And if you ever want to rebuild a cylinder head on your car, you can. So the cylinder head's looking pretty nice now, as you can tell. Really clean, looking pretty good. Maybe a little bit of dirt on those threads, but we'll get there. And then you can see here how we have an aluminum head, and then inside in this area there is like a hardened steel valve seat. So they press this into the cylinder head from the factory, and that way, so when the valve actuates, it doesn't start eating into this aluminum, and it's called, like the valve doesn't sink into the cylinder head. So what we're going to be doing next is we're going to be matching the surface where the valve sits on the seat to the valve, and that way we'll get really good sealing on the compression stroke. And this is called valve lapping, and it's pretty old school method, and it's just a lot of fun to really do a good job and know that you're doing the job right, and to have really good pride in the work that you're doing at the end of the day. So we're going to get a valve lapping tool. You can find this at any auto parts store, and a little bit of oil. And then we're also going to have some valve grinding compound. So this is auto parts store stuff as well. And what we're going to do is we're going to dip the valve into the oil. And since this valve during this procedure is experiencing like twisting operation, like twisting, that's why we have the oil. Typically the valve goes back and forth in the cylinder head, but since we're putting a different loading on it, we're going to want to lubricate that. So we're going to get the valve grinding compound, and we're going to put it on the sealing face of the valve, where it interfaces with the valve guide. And you don't need a lot, just a little bit, just to coat it. And then we're going to twist back and forth, and you'll notice that the harmonic of the valve grinding compound changes. Let's listen for that. Here it goes from like rough to like very quiet. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull it up, twist it 90 degrees, and then do that again. Okay, pull it up, twist it 90 degrees, and then do that again. Pull it up, twist it 90 degrees, and then do it again. This thing likes to move all over the place, don't worry about that. And so what happens is, as you lap the valve with this valve grinding compound, the actual grit of the grinding compound changes. So you go from a very coarse grit, very rough sanding, to a finer sanding. And then what this is doing is it's creating a good interface between the cylinder head and the valve so it seals properly. So we're going to pull it out. I do that about typically 4 times. And we're going to get 2 clean rags. One rag is going to be for the actual valve stem right here. and we're going to hold that and clean off all the oil. And then we're going to get the other clean rag and clean off all that abrasion media. Just like that. Cool. Put the valve aside. Okay. Then we're going to go in here and clean it up as good as possible. We don't want to get this anywhere else. And then when we come back, after all these valves are done, we're going to go ahead and clean it up again. Probably using brake clean, soap and water, and get any sort of this abrasion media out of the cylinder head, because when we put it into service, we do not want to have this anywhere. And if you ever suspect contamination between the valve guide and the valve stem, like you get valve grinding compound right here, just stop, clean it off, make sure it's all clean. You do not want to like sand, you're basically like sanding the sealing portion of the valve. So let's just avoid that. If you expect any sort of contamination, just don't do that. So what I'm gonna do, we did that once, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and do that twice. I don't know, this is just my general rule. Some people get away with just doing it once, but I don't know, I guess I'm just particular, I suppose. So after you finish lapping the valves, you can see that continuous gray band on the outer perimeter of the valve. And that's a good sign that we have a good valve lapping on here, and it interfaces with the cylinder head correctly. And since we match the valve to the actual port that we're lapping, that tapered surface finish actually matches perfectly to the tapered profile on this valve insert. Now all the valves are lapped, and we're going to disassemble and clean it one last time, and then we can finally assemble the cylinder head. So we can start installing the valve stem seals onto the valve guide. So you can see down here, there's the valve guide, and then right on top goes the valve stem seal. And we're not going to want to press directly down onto the face of that valve stem seal. We're going to get a valve stem seal installation tool. You can also use a socket. So what this does is it transmits the force onto the metal portion on the side and not onto the rubberized portion on the top. So I did a final clean of the intake and exhaust valves, and we can finally do a final install on these valves, and they'll be perfect. Grab the first spring. Just fit on there just like that. We get our valve spring compressor tool, and this will start compressing the spring for us. And avoid this bearing cap right here, this bearing surface. The tool likes to mar into it if you're not careful. So just something to watch out for. There's one. I don't know if you saw that. That's just a pain in the butt. It's like doing surgery. It really is. Okay. Like to grab onto the keeper a little bit. There we go. See how they're both seated properly? Okay, now let's carefully and slowly take off that spring tension. So you might ask, why don't I just use the socket in the bag trick, where you kind of place the keepers right on the top, and then you put the bag over the top a little bit, and then you just force it on, and then it like forces the keepers into it. And I have one reason why this doesn't work. So if you look closely, there's literally no tolerance between the keepers and this body. So when the keepers are fully compressed and the spring is installed and onto the valve, there's like literally no slop or play whatsoever. So if you have like a Honda motor or something a little bit less tolerance than this one, you'll see a little bit of a gap, and that bag trick will work. But for us on this Lamborghini motor, we're gonna have just a little bit more issue, and that's why we have to do that old school kind of pain in the butt spring compressor method. Okay, now you might say, that's great and all, but you left the manifold on, dude. How the heck are you gonna get this thing around that whole entire exhaust manifold? And I'll show you a special tool that I'm gonna use that's different than this one. And it's a little bit more finicky, but it prevents us from having to break off all these dang bolts that are just impossible to reach and rusted to hell. I don't care if you have a Bugatti or a Honda, you're always gonna have rusted exhaust manifold bolts. That's like the truism of life, I swear. Instead, we can use a tool like this, where you have a bar that goes across and then it bolts down to the top of the cylinder head, and then you have this little spring compressor that has a lever arm and then we can go ahead and compress the springs this way. And when you do this, just put a rag underneath the cylinder that you're working on so the valve doesn't sink in and fall out of the head. All the springs are in. Now we can start putting the rockers on. So installation of the rocker and roller is actually pretty easy. So for this piece, we'll just put a little bit of assembly lube on it, put it inside the oiling port, put a little assembly lube on this piece, and then the valve. And then you just place the rocker right on top. Next, we're going to install the camshafts. So put some assembly lube on these valleys where the camshaft sits and the rocker rollers. So any metal to metal interface, you're going to want to put a lot of assembly lube on just to make sure everything's lubricated when you start this motor up again. Just like that. There you go. I'm almost out of assembly lube. But I think we have enough for this. And then that interface. Okay. So now we're going to take our intake camshaft, and you'll know which camshaft is which because there is the timing bolt at the top. And if the timing bolt is facing towards the sky and these little eyelids built into the camshaft are facing towards the inside, like let's say facing towards the spark plug, that way you know it's like the correct camshaft. So let's say we put it on the exhaust side. This is incorrect because these eyelids are facing the outside of the car now. So just look for the bolt and then look for the eyelid, and you'll know which one's the intake and the exhaust camshaft, if you ever get them mixed up, that is. And the camshaft is going to be a little bit crooked when you install it, because no matter how you put this camshaft in, there's always going to be a certain lobe that's trying to depress down some springs, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to get the top of the galley that actually holds down the camshafts, and we're going to equally distribute the torque load through the bolts to then vary the load out and start pressing down the camshaft and then subsequently pressing down the springs. And we're going to be checking to make sure that the camshafts rotate freely and there's no binding or anything like that. And then we can install the cam. So everything's clean and we're going to apply RTV to it. You can see these machine grooves where the RTV needs to go. Here's an example of what I already did. And then if you can look at the top, here's another example of the groove that follows along the outside of that perimeter. So all we're going to do is we're going to find the groove and then apply RTV inside of it. All right, so let's put some lubricant on the bearing surfaces a little bit more, right on the top, where the camshaft's going to be seated against. Not too much though, because we don't want it to squeeze out onto our gasketed mating surface. Come back, touch up any mated surface area that will have RTV on it, and you do not want to have assembly lubricant on it. And we get this cam cover, and we're going to align it with the two dowels on the side opposite from us. And then just let it more or less sit there. Okay. So you might notice that it's not really sitting on flush with the surface. So what happens is the springs are trying to push down on one of the lobes of the camshafts. So what I'm going to do, and Lamborghini doesn't really specify anything, so I'm going to put the fasteners in and then try to equally distribute the load with the fasteners across this cam cover plate. And that'll push down the springs and it'll push down the valves, and it will make this the camshaft seat nicely in here without any sort of binding or anything like that. So I'm going to get something and put it underneath the exhaust manifold. Give you whatever, I'm using a wheel spacer, just because the valves are going to be opening a little bit. Start throwing these fasteners in here. All right, and this is a T30 Torx, so I'm going to start in the middle. Doesn't really matter. I just want to start pushing the camshafts down a little bit. So I'm going to do that one, and then I'm going to do the bottom right. What I'm trying to do is just evenly distribute this clamping load across the camshafts and start to evenly put pressure on the camshafts. And when we get the screws down like kind of hand tight, we can look around the side and make sure that we have even spacing on all the corners. And that will be kind of a guidepost for if we're doing it correctly, and like which side needs a little bit more force and which one needs a little bit less force. Because you might think that this whole girdle is pretty strong and rigid, but it does flex just a little bit. Or as you were, I'm going to throw them in the partitions where the cam lock tool goes. And I'm periodically just going to check for play, make sure that nothing's binding, nothing weird is happening, right? I tightened it all down and I evenly distributed the load. I'm pretty happy with it. And the camshafts still are free, so that's good. A little bit of force here. There we go. They're on which lifter? This one? Yeah, this one right here. It's a little bit harder to turn, but they still turn. Nice and easy. Now we're going to come back and apply a final tightening torque of 10 Newton meters. I'm going to start from this side going to this side. That was a common practice in a lot of Audis, but so I'm just going to follow that same nomenclature. Although I can't find it for this car, I'm not too concerned about it. And that's it. Just a little bit of elbow grease, a little bit of diligence, and you can have this cylinder head immaculate once again. So if you like this video, please consider giving it a like. In future videos, we're going to be doing the timing on this motor, putting the cylinder heads back on, and then finally installing this thing and letting it run. So very exciting, and I'm looking forward to that. And until next time, thanks.